Hi, I'm Elizabeth Lewis, author of Little Falls, which will be released in August of this year. Thanks so much for joining us on this video for Virtual Thriller Fest 2020. Really excited to be able to present to you some of the research methods that I've found helpful and that I've talked with other folks about being helpful for them. I'm a lawyer by day, so I'm basically a paid researcher, writer, and general smartass. So I do this for a living every day anyway. Obviously, legal research methods are rather different than researching for fiction, which is what we're here to talk about today. So with that, let's get started on some slides that I prepared for the presentation. I'll just share my screen. So how to research your book. Obviously, if you're watching this video, you must have some kind of affinity for fiction, probably thrillers, given that this is for Virtual Thriller Fest 2020. Fictional research is quite a bit different than nonfiction, and of course it's a little bit different in each genre also. I write mystery and crime, so this is definitely oriented towards that genre. So, of course, we're all taught to write what you know. So that means that you don't have to research, right? You just, boom, you write whatever you know and you're done. Well, that's not really true. Every writer has sort of their own internal thoughts about the subject that they're writing about. Every one of us is unique and we don't necessarily see the entire world as it really is objectively. And so research is actually really important, even when you're writing fiction, in order to get various things right. So why research? Authenticity. You don't want to jar the reader. Obviously, we're all inside of our own heads, but your reader is inside of their head. And so you need to also think about what the reader knows about the world and also what the world is objectively. Innovation. None of us really wants to tell the same story 500 times, right? That gets very boring for the reader and they just stop reading or they don't even pick up your book to begin with. Research is actually really helpful for coming up with, the next twist in the story or what comes towards the end of your story or what the right sort of high point in your book is. I've come up with a lot of different stories just by reading things that I'm interested in. For example, archaeology magazines. I'm kind of an archaeology nut. And I've come up with a couple of different historical fiction pieces that I'm working on sort of on the side because of that reading. Escapism, again, getting out of your own head in order to get into your characters. Memoirs and things like that are really great for that because you want to see the world through your character's eyes. Consistency. Again, don't draw the reader by maybe saying something about a place on page 22 that differs from what you say about it on 107. Obviously, some of that internal consistency comes out in the editing process, but research can also be really helpful because until you really know your subject, it's hard to be consistent. It's hard to remember what are the facts that you want to bring out. So what to research? In writing fiction, the things that I've found that I consistently need to research are visuals and people. So visuals are things like, what does the house look like inside? What does the office building look like inside? What do the mountains look like? So for example, Little Falls is set in the Okanagan, which is a region in Washington state. The inside of the houses, okay, not that challenging, right? Except I have to think about, well, what are my demographics? What are my socioeconomic characteristics? Because that's obviously going to dictate what the inside of people's buildings look like. The outside, of course, you can get a lot of information just by visiting a place or looking at pictures of it or something along those lines. Clothing and things, of course, are extremely important to get those details right. It would be very strange if you're writing a historical fiction piece set in the 1920s, if you're talking about a cell phone, that's super obvious. What's less obvious though is, well, okay, if you have a historical fiction piece that has bake-like handles, for example, or twisty telephone cords or something along those lines, it's important to think about, well, what era were those things actually included in? Because inevitably someone in your readership is going to know what's right, and that's going to jar them if you get it wrong. People, of course, are interesting research subjects, obviously for character development, but also for patois, for lingo and unique terms within an industry or within a subset of culture. So for example, in Little Falls, my main character is a US Army veteran. She's a combat medic. I'm a Navy vet, but I'm from the intelligence community. And the lingo is quite a bit different, frankly, across services and then also within the services in different areas. So it's really important for me to go out and study what some of the various patterns of speech, the lingo, the types of situations that my main character might have found herself in, things along those lines. Pacing and habits and mannerisms, of course, are somewhat unique to each character, but our social milieu, I'm a sociologist by training, of course, the situations in which we find ourselves in social situations really impact how you interact with other people and how you interact with things. And there are certain commonalities among groups of people based on where they've grown up, what industry they work in, where they live now, disabilities, for example, things along those lines. So research is something that we all do to one extent or another in our daily lives. Obviously, if you're trying to find the next TV that you want to buy or the next book, that's a form of research. And there are a lot of old school methods, of course, books and maps primarily. I mentioned maps because they can be helpful for figuring out, where is your character traveling to and from? Something as simple as that. It's especially important if you're putting the setting in a real place. So for example, Okanagan County, or also if you're putting it into a fictional place, not that you're going to look at a real map, but you may draw a map for yourself. And you need to understand how travel works in various geographic areas if you're going to include details on those lines. Books are a little bit obviously. There are different kinds of books that I found to be particularly helpful in research. Memoirs kind of go without saying. Textbooks and other technical reading, popular nonfiction. All of those categories have been pretty useful for me in the past, and for those of us, for those of my friends who are also writers. Fiction, I feel like, is less useful, frankly, simply because as writers, we all infuse our writing with various things that we think or know, and points that we want to make too. And that can make fiction somewhat unreliable as research. So for instance, when I was researching Little Falls, there are a few different books that came up for me. Love My Rifle More Than You is a memoir written by a female soldier who went out to Iraq. She was in the intelligence community, but she was forward deployed. Odysseus in America is popular nonfiction written by a psychologist who works for the Veterans Affairs Administration. He has worked extensively with folks from who have service time in Vietnam, as well as the first Gulf War. His books are not textbooks. I would classify them as pop psychology, although they are quite informed by a professional view. And they're also really helpful. He includes a lot of stories and accounts from some of his patients, which are really helpful. Traumatic Brain Injury is a VA publication. I'm lucky enough to be related to a well-respected and regarded VA internist. My stepdad spent over 30 years in the VA and specialized in a lot of PTSD issues with his patients. And so this TBI document is one that he received from training in the VA, and which was actually fairly helpful for me during my research. Michael Connolly, my favorite book of his, honestly, is Crime Beat. And it's really about his journalism days. And so it's not that I used this particular book when I was writing Little Falls, but some of the accounts and the various ways in which the police approached crime, and then also how the journalists approach crime stories, were really helpful in terms of figuring out, well, how does your main character go about solving a crime or investigating a crime when they're not a professional? So other kinds of old school methods, of course, interaction. And this is a sort of a bucket category for interviews, immersive experiences, and the culture in which you're writing about. So for example, if you're writing about England, it would probably help to have lived there for a while. If you are writing about another place other than where you grew up or where you've spent a lot of time, it can be a lot harder to get some of the mannerisms and the patterns of speech right. Interviews are really helpful. So for example, when writing Little Falls, I spoke with several different officers who had been deployed and who had had soldiers under their command in the medical corps in Iraq and Afghanistan. That was extremely helpful. I also spoke with several enlisted folks who had been forward deployed and talked with them about their experiences, and also talked with folks who they are familiar with. So for example, spouses can also be very helpful for sort of the civilian experience. I mentioned court records, not because I'm a lawyer, but because they can actually be really helpful. A lot of court records court records are generally public, first of all. And also, court records often include accounts of the police investigation, and sometimes they have transcripts of interviews with criminals. Those can actually be pretty insightful, frankly. Not only if you're going to include some kind of a scene with an interrogation or something along those lines, but also just in terms of figuring out how people tell their stories and how professionals try to elicit those stories. But remember the acknowledgements when you're talking with people or interviewing them, particularly if they're comfortable being acknowledged. It's usually helpful to ask. Modern methods, and this is really what I want to concentrate on for this presentation. Modern methods of research are a little different than the old school methods, but especially during this whole COVID-19 crisis thing that we're currently living in, some of the modern methods are actually really helpful. They're also really helpful for those of us like me who have really limited time to write and research. So for example, I'm often doing this stuff at 11:30 at night or at 4:30 in the morning. And I'm not gonna have access to a library or records of any sort. I'm certainly not gonna be interviewing somebody at 4:30 in the morning, unless maybe they live in Europe. So modern methods can be extremely helpful. They can also be not helpful because, like many things on the internet, you know, there's a limit and there's some questionable sources out there. So of course, look at it with the lens of seeking truth and filtering that from fiction. YouTube and Vimeo can be really helpful. Various kinds of internet sources that have videos. Historical and contemporary sources are on there. When I was researching a WIP a few years ago, WIP didn't go anywhere, but I found a really helpful video on, frankly, old school methods for hog harvesting. I wanted to have a scene in the book that had something to do with the fall harvest in France, and I had no idea how you go about, or how it was historically dealt with anyway. But I found a really helpful video on YouTube. It took a little while, and there were certainly some things on there that I didn't really want to see, but there you go. Contemporary goes without saying. Most videos available online are contemporary. A lot of these videos can be helpful for instructional purposes, for lingo, for imagery. I'm researching a book right now where one of the characters are learning how to use a shotgun. And so for instructional videos, YouTube is extremely helpful. This guy, Chris Chang, has a series of videos online on YouTube that are really great. I mean, like, I've shot shotguns before, but I don't live and breathe them. So I need to understand exactly, you know, how do you stand? Where are the impact points? What does it look like when you screw up and you do it wrong? Where does it hurt when you do that? And so some of these videos on YouTube are really helpful for that. Other modern methods, in Instagram and Twitter, they have their limits, but they can be helpful, in particular if you've got people who are using them and you need to know how to document that in your fiction. And also if you're looking for particular facts. So for example, on Instagram, there are folks who post about different kinds of places that they visited or places where they live. Some of those visuals can be really helpful, particularly because some people on Instagram anyway post things that are unscripted. It's not all just pretty pictures that have all been set up. Those unscripted photos can actually be pretty helpful. Twitter is primarily good, I've found, for lingo and also asking for help. So there are a lot of writers on Twitter. Many of them have researched different things or have different experiences. It's really helpful to be able to reach out to that community sometimes. Google Maps and Street View, I love Google Maps. It's really great, frankly, for getting a visual picture of places and being able to sort of explore without leaving your house or your apartment. So for example, in Little Falls is set in a town that's fictional, a town called Little Falls. but it's loosely modeled on a town in Washington State called Lewes. Lewes is a teeny town that takes forever to get to. It's way up in the mountains. And so this is a shot of Google Street View. Now, I've been to Lewes a few times to wander around and sort of do some research on the ground, but it's a lot easier to just get in front of Street View to go look at pictures of Lewes in order to make sure that I've got some of the visuals right. I've got an idea of the socioeconomics there, and then also just generally speaking, how people interact. Now, it can be difficult to determine how people interact just by looking at images online. I mentioned I have some intelligence experience, so one of the things that I love about visuals is being able to sort of stitch together the puzzle, which you can definitely do with a little bit of creativity, which we all have in spades, right? Other modern methods, county and other local records have often gone online. Now, this is more true in cities than it is in rural areas. But so, for example, I live in Seattle. King County Records has a pretty good database for properties. And not all properties have this, but many properties actually have some historical photos associated with records. That can be helpful if you want to set a book in a particular place at a particular time, because I guarantee you most city blocks today don't look like they did 70 years ago. And so if you can find some of those historical photos through local official records, that can be extremely helpful. Demographic analyses, again, this is something that requires some creativity, but I mentioned demographic analyses for a couple of different reasons. One, they can be good sources of names, particularly for historical fiction. So for example, names that are popular today were not necessarily popular 50 years ago. And so it can be helpful to go back and think of a name that might resonate with readers. They can also be really helpful for trying to figure out what neighborhoods may have looked like or may have felt like, or the types of peoples who may have been in a particular location at a particular time. So for example, you can often go into census records and find a breakdown of the racial groups in a particular location. Typically it's, Caucasian, African American, Latino, Native American, things along those lines, with greater or lesser specificity as time goes by. That can be really helpful for making sure that you're accurately representing a place. So for example, a couple of weeks ago, and I'm sure this happens periodically, but on Twitter there was something of a debate about whether or not books should be set among solely one particular cultural group. Well, that probably works in some cases. And in other cases, it's going to feel a little bit strange if you have, only white characters in the middle of, say, Kenya. It's going to be a little odd in that case. But there's a lot of variation within those categories. Blogs and local publications. So blogs are helpful often because people blog about what they're doing and who they are and what they're doing. They can be mostly helpful for sort of adding a little bit of color. I don't rely on blogs a whole lot, but I've occasionally found some interesting information. Local publications, a lot of them have gone online in recent years. They can be very helpful for sort of the local feel or the small town feel. I've found some really interesting articles, for example, out of Alaska that way, and then also out of some smaller towns in England and other places in the country. But of course, we all know that journalism is not doing so well these days, and a lot of local publications have shut down. Some of them have maintained historical records online, which can be helpful for historical fiction, and others they just haven't. So if you can find it, they can be really quite useful, but otherwise it can be a little bit like searching for a needle in a haystack. So thanks very much for joining me for this video. I hope it was useful. I would love to hear about the things that are helpful for you when you're researching your fiction. You can find me online at elizabethlewes.com, as well as on Twitter and Instagram with the same handle. Please feel free to reach out, and if I can be of any help, please feel free to reach out with questions also. Thank you for joining.